What's that?
Hey everyone, welcome back to your favorite sales podcast. I'm your host, Ross Rich, and today we have a very special guest and a special episode because we're kind of pivoting things away from just having revenue leaders here, and we actually have CEO and founder of a call it revenue enablement sales incentive. You can describe your company better than I can in a moment, Nabeil, but another founder and CEO on today, and really excited to dive into his personal story and top 3 tips around driving execution excellence. So welcome to the show, Nabeil.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's good to be on.
Well, before we dive into all things sales incentives, quota, like a lot of things top of mind, I think, especially today as the markets turn and as we think about, maybe having smaller, more productive, high performance teams and wanting to keep the best folks the most motivated. Would love to hear a bit about your personal journey and story going from, basically taking on being co-founder and CEO, and what kind of got you passionate about this space in particular.
Yeah, absolutely. To some extent, I think being an entrepreneur and being a sales person kind of go hand in hand. You have to be able to sell a vision.
Yes.
I would say, I want to say I entered the world of sales a long time ago, but prior to founding Forma, I worked at a major consulting firm that specialized in sales and marketing strategy. So you think about Fortune 500s, thousands of sellers, if not tens of thousands across the globe, all executing on different strategies where you have hundreds, thousands of different products you're selling at that scale. We would be brought in to support them on the design and execution of said strategy. And at the end of the day, the larger the organization becomes, the bigger of an optimization problem
Yes.
it is to design a
Every percent is a bigger number, right? A percent of early stage company in terms of sales comp is, not as important as, like you said, tens of thousands of sellers.
Yeah, exactly. Right. It's like one small tweak and you can get a better outcome. And at the end of the day, like no matter what scale company you are, optimizing your go-to-market strategy, there's a bunch of levers. And if I put more into this lever, I'm going to take away from over here. And it's not just for incentives across the board, right? If I optimize for a certain customer segment, I'm going to penalize another customer segment. If I optimize for a certain rep profile, I'm going to penalize my enablement of a different profile. And so we would go in, we build these strategies. And what I saw was that, the world of sales was changing. The firm that I worked at did both sales and marketing consulting. Marketing was going through this renaissance moment where all of a sudden you have more data, more access to tools, interconnected technology where you can scale workflows and truly create attribution at the unique individual, like customer engagement level. And so marketing just saw this massive data revolution. And yet in sales, we were still incentivizing and recommending go-to-market strategies where the same comp plan is rolled out across 10,000 sellers globally, even though, one jurisdiction, one set of products should be sold and the customer engagement and experience should be radically different than somewhere else. The organizations were not set up for agility and the dynamicism that is required to leverage all the data that's at their disposal. And so I founded Forma with the vision of how do you bring self-performance management agility and leverage AI to optimize for the right incentive, for the right rep at the right time. And the journey started in 2016. And today we manage billions of comp for large Fortune 500s across the globe, supporting them to be able to roll out incentives in real time and tailored to the exact selling behavior that they want to drive within a specific team.
That's very cool. And I love that. I find a lot of, no offense to other folks out there that might have not been working on their problem before they started the company, but I find the best companies are driven by folks that actually experienced firsthand the problem and tried to solve it without technology instead of trying to build a business and a technology company and searching for a problem. You know what I mean? I think that's where the best insights and, hearing that story, like you were working on this challenge with your target market, with the existing landscape, seeing how other people are solving similar problems and had that insight versus like, hey, I want to start a company. How do I think about, the right market to target and all that kind of stuff? Yeah.
Yeah. And then just to change it there, I think there's a lot of value to having an outsider lens onto a problem. So I would say like if someone had worked in this space for 15 to 20 years, I actually don't know if they would approach it with a unique way.
Yes,
I
yes, yes. You
feel
had,
like,
you had a,
oh,
a
yeah,
lens, but you were trying to solve the same problem that that person for the last 30 years has been trying to solve. But I was more saying like you
yes,
were still focused on this problem instead of like, how do I search for a problem
100%. Yes.
and
Yeah.
using
Living
technology
and
as a
breathing it.
tool. Yeah,
Yeah. Living and breathing it. You see it. And especially like the more complex the problem is, which if anything in building a go-to-market engine is complex in nature. And so, yeah, the closer you get for sure.
totally, totally. Well, before we shift gears to our strategies for execution excellence, any surprises that you've had either in the spaces in general when you came in and hey, starting this company, I assumed this, but I got that, or just kind of key lessons that you've learned from transitioning from, being an IC or working at a company to being a founder and CEO?
Yeah. I mean, I think you hear this quite, commonly across the board where you jump from a well-known logo, a well-known player in the space. You don't appreciate that like 800-pound gorilla of just having that logo behind you, right? And so I think, uh, starting a company, doing anything innovative, like it's a lot harder to sell that vision earlier
Yes.
on. Even though you have the same experience that you had when you were working at the much larger, uh, you know, firm, but or like company, or again, it's still in the same space. I think that maybe a little bit of a surprise, but I think at the end of the day, whenever you're trying to disrupt an industry, it's not going to be easy because you are fundamentally changing human behavior. People are so averse to change.
Hmm.
So you really have to drive that, 10x benefit and demonstrate that you can do that very quickly in order to kind of overcome all the obstacles. But yeah, I would say maybe it shouldn't have come as a surprise, but it became a little bit of a surprise in the early days.
No, I agree. I think you touched on something that I don't think gets talked a lot about, and I think it gets talked about in the opposite. I think when you have something that's you know up to the right in the innovation, um, kind of axis, it actually makes it harder to get started because it's so far from what you said, the behavior or even mindset of thinking about solving a problem. And so the further you get from the status quo, maybe if it was a bit better, but solved in a similar way and cheaper or faster or one axis different, it's actually probably faster to get to success, but maybe not as exponential, as big of a win or really changing things for the better. But when you have even more innovation, it's almost slower and harder to start because the group of early adopters and innovators, true innovators, are going to be your only target market, which is typically what, maybe 5%
Yeah.
of the market. So I think that's something that I definitely took for granted. I don't think it's talked a lot about when you think about product market fit, starting a company, talking to customers, the access of innovation compared to status quo, that being harder, but again, probably a bigger win for the company if they could figure it out, but especially the customers, changing the
Yeah,
way they do
100%.
things. So,
Yeah. And to touch on it, because I think we both kind of solved problems for larger organizations. And so it makes it like
yeah, not just the really
further
small
more.
startup. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Right. So it makes it even more difficult because you do have to find those visionaries, but you're trying to find visionaries in the early days at large organizations, which, I mean, think about the sales enablement space, are bombarded with every new startup going after them.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, like when the more you're disrupting in the enterprise, the more difficult it is in those early days to break through the noise, find the visionaries, get them on board,
Yeah.
and demonstrate value as fast as possible so that you can, take those customers and use that as momentum in
Totally.
the market.
It's the hard job, and it's why it's why my hairline has been receding since starting a cord. But okay, shifting gears to our top three strategies for execution excellence. Obviously the first one is around sales incentives and using it as a growth lever. I think a lot of people view sales compensation as a cost, not a growth lever. So curious to hear how you think about that and some of the best practices you picked up from working with some of the best in the business.
Yeah. I mean, I think, so the term coin operated from a sales perspective in terms of like, you hear all the time, like sales is coin operated. I mean, to some extent, it's not it shouldn't be taken as a negative thing, right? At the end of the day, sales is risky. I think it's very few roles in an organization where you make one mistake, it's game over, right? Like if you're running a sales motion and you send the wrong email, you don't address the customer concern the right way, there is no second chance. I mean, there's a reason why it's like, just get to the next step.
Binary.
Get
Yeah.
to the next step. because if the moment you lose, that's it. You've lost the deal. And you've walked away. So to me, you take this massive risk in the role of sales, and it's taken because it's remunerated with the comp.
Yes.
So everyone understands this concept, right? This kind of pay for performance, but very few companies actually truly pay for performance. And when I say that, like when you're thinking about using it as growth lever, put your money where your mouth is. A 50% attainment rep should make very little money. So if you think, like, the biggest feedback I have is, you want to make this a growth lever, ensure one, you're actually paying for performance, and two, be aggressive with that. So pay your bottom performers very little, a third, quarter of what the average rep makes, and pay your top performers, your top 10, 15%, 3 times, 4 times. Like, you want those reps to be making so much money. And so this concept of like the reverse Robin Hood. I want to steal from the poor to pay the rich, because that's how incentives become so well respected, and you get the best performers in the organization so well motivated by those incentives.
Yeah.
A lot harder said, or thought.
I was about to say, how do you do that? Because even setting up some basic comp structures that I've built can feel overwhelming and complicated. Now I'm thinking about, those complex accelerators and decelerators and clawback and all this stuff. So yeah, what are some of maybe the basics that you feel like you're doing a good job at this with maybe not doing the most complex thing possible?
Yeah. I mean, on the actual like pay curve side, I think there's a lot of different tactics to simplify them. I can, share a handful here, but the most difficult part of that is actually the quota setting. Because, and this is what I mean by most organizations aren't actually paying for performance, because what is good performance in sales? Okay. Well, you're measured against your target. And in reality, we think, okay, this rep is 120% to target.
Yeah.
But did we set the target in a way where we're confident that 120% is actually reflective of a 20% greater than target performance? Or was it, set in a way where there's so many variables that could deviate that this rep just so happened to have kind of a windfall that year, and they're actually at 120%. So I think first and foremost, setting the right targets is critical.
Yeah.
Because the pay curve that I'm talking about, where you're super aggressive on top performers versus low performers,
is all relative to that. Yeah.
It's all relative
that's the
to
thing.
that.
It's
And
relative
if you don't
to.
get it right, I mean, you could seriously be in a very financially risky position where you all of a sudden now pay a lot of reps way more than they should be making.
Yeah.
You could have a big financial impact. So,
Or top reps quitting. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Your best reps are actually, exactly, getting underpaid. So I would say, like, okay, first and most important focus is quota setting. You get that right. I think the accelerators have to tie back and kind of that pay curve to not make it overly complex. You kind of tie it back to what what you expect from a sales motion. And so if you go through and you take a look, and I'll give an example of, like, retention. So if I have a retention team, an account management team, my expectation of performance is not that if you're retaining 90% of the business, that's not a good performance measure.
It could be the mean of the business, period.
Yeah, that's like,
yeah.
exactly. That's like the bare bones. That's what I want you to get to.
Yeah.
Versus, if you're, 10% above on your attainment for, net, like for net new, and kind of a similar lines, if you're 10% above on attainment for net new, very small difference from the average for most organizations, compared to being 10% above your attainment for retention. Right.
Yes.
And so there's an element of like, okay, you need to think about the sales motion and what it means at different tranches of performance.
Yeah.
And then tie your pay curve to that and be able to communicate that. So even if you have a lot of different tranches along the way, and your pay curve is more complex, if you could tie it back to the narrative of what performance actually means and why you set that, I think it's part of the storytelling of rolling out any new comp plan to your sales team, which should be done. Rarely is it done well, I think.
Yes.
And the primary reason for that is because sales managers and sales leaders are human beings, and no one wants to talk about comp.
Yeah, it's very uncomfortable. Yeah.
Comfortable. Yeah.
That's interesting. Well, maybe let's just go back to the quota setting, since I agree, think about this, everything is relative. You can't do a good job of any of the plans without having the right quota. Maybe as just an example to dig into the details, let's say it's like a mid-market new business team. how do you think about best practice? What I've heard has been more around a baseline, like OTE to quota to OTE ratio of like minimum being probably 3 to 1, best in class being 5 to 1 plus in terms of like how much someone's quota is relative to how much they get paid in sales. What are some of those other things that leaders should be thinking about when they're setting quota, both at the company kind of like, metrics level, as well as the, um, historicals and using all those different heuristics?
So quota setting is inherently tied to territory. Like if you think about it, and a really good analogy I've heard about this is kind of think about going to a bar. So you go into a bar, empty, and there's a bartender that's, sitting there. I mean, you're going to get a very personalized experience, great customer experience. You'll get served very quickly, but that bar is potentially overstaffed, right? Because they're not generating as much revenue from a single bartender as they could.
Yeah.
You go into a bar packed, but there's only one bartender. Now that bar is generating revenue, but they're missing out on a lot of potential revenue because it takes you 10 minutes, 15 minutes to get a drink. Right. So there's a lot of drinks that are not being served as fast. And so, I think when we talk about like the OTE to quota ratio, that's just one factor of it. But really,
Yeah.
ultimately, the real consideration is how much potential is there that we're enabling that rep to go surface and get. So if you wanted to simplify that to just purely OTE and quota, then you need to make territories not a thing and basically have kind of like like a dividing of the universe evenly,
Yeah.
and every deal gets routed through. So if you have that kind of model, then you effectively don't have the concept of territories.
Yeah. Yeah.
The
Sort of a round robin. Let's
Yeah.
assume it's within just assuming like the simplest thing ever. It's within, we round robin within the US for mid-market deals.
Exactly. And then now I would go one step further and say, okay, you can do the OTE to quota, but what you should really do is then a workload buildup methodology, right? Because I need to understand, okay, well, what does it take to get a deal over the line? It takes X number of meetings. It takes X for, and everything in sales should go back to what is the experience I want my end customer to have, right? Our sales process is not about me. It's about what is the process that's going to enable the customer to actually make the right decision and address that.
How long is it going to take? What does the land look like versus the expand? Blah blah blah. Yeah,
exactly. So like, how many, how much time does it take for a rep to fulfill and run a sales motion the way that we think is high quality?
Yep.
And then you factor in how many deals they can manage at a time, et cetera, average win rates, conversions, and now you can work your way into what should be a realistic quota that we're going to set for the skill set that we're hiring to tackle that. Okay, that's assuming you balance the territories to this round robin approach.
Yeah.
If you actually have targeted territories, and there's a lot of businesses which it does make sense to have, that kind of one-to-one relationship, because sales processes typically will go much further. They'll spend multiple years, et cetera, relationships that get built up.
Mm-hmm.
In that moment, now, if we are not capturing customer specific data and attributes, we're missing out on truly balancing the core.
What does that mean? Is that like how much they could spend in terms of budget or?
Yeah. I mean, so this is the thing. There's so much data available that the more you bring in, actually, the better predictability we can have. But a perfect example would be there some sort of potential associated with each customer. So that could be like how much they're willing to spend. Maybe it's a business or a customer that is government. Now, okay, well, that's all public. Their public spend is publicly available.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we have to come up with an attribute of looking at other data sets to figure out what is the potential that they're going to spend and curate that, because it's very important for us as a business confident. But I'll go further. It actually, think about the stakeholders you're selling into. Who are they? So a perfect example would be, okay, this stakeholder historically has used products X, Y, and Z, and they're more likely to purchase more like newer or more innovative products. Okay, that is
and you would incorporate that in a compensation structure or territory plan.
I mean, if you have the data available, you should.
Yeah.
And the argument is, why don't you have that data available if you've been in this market for a decade? Like, you want to bring in as much data as possible, attribute it, tag it the right way, and then bring that into your quota setting process. And the ideal way to do it is not, you can kind of guess at this, but effectively there's just this is where it's like, it is a data science problem. The bigger the organization is, the more data you have. All you're looking is for statistical like confidence that this attribute, this metric is going to drive towards a better outcome. And so, I think quota setting is ultimately one of the most, one of the highest ROI data science projects you can undertake in your go-to-market motion.
Totally. Well, my mind is blown about how much more sophisticated this is than I even took for granted. But yeah, no, super, super interesting to think about. Like you said, the lever this is for your growth and arming your best performers, making sure they get paid, making sure the worst performers who aren't contributing in a way that's fair to their goal aren't taking away from them. Like you said, there's the trade-off. The money's going to somewhere. Is it going to them? Is it going to the top performers? So that's really, really interesting. And a lot more, I don't want to say complex because it's not complex, but like there's so many details to it.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, you can
like simple, but very detailed.
Yeah.
That's super interesting. Well, shifting gears to the next piece, making sure earning opportunities are fair and transparent across the rep base. In my experience selling and leading teams, have never been on a very transparent, from a comp structure perspective. So curious to hear some best practices around that.
Yeah. So two things that's interesting is that when you ask reps, why don't they feel that they have transparency in their comp structure? It's rarely the comp plan. What it is, it's the crediting rules associated with the comp plan. So what do I mean? What do I mean when I say crediting rules? So you have a comp plan. It's usually relatively simple. You get paid 5% for this. You get paid for this. This is on a back to $1 structure. But the nuance is, if you only get paid for SaaS, not for professional services, as an example.
Yeah.
Oh, well, this SKU, if it's purchased from this customer base segment, is actually classified as professional services versus SaaS. And this is not the best example, but like that is actually the biggest crux is like understanding, okay, when I make a sale, which bucket of my comp plan does it actually fit in?
Yeah.
When I make this, I have $1 million opportunity in Salesforce. Where do I get credit for the whole million? Does half of it get credit to a different team because a product specialist is added on? That's the complexity that typically we see that takes away from the transparency is like that part. But the ideal way to actually solve this problem is having visibility to the reps that shows them how the data from their upstream, like the quote creation.
Like even before they close the deal and get paid,
exactly.
they can
Like
actually see how it's calculated. Yeah.
Yeah. Like how does that translate to what your comp plan looks like? And this is almost kind of nudging. It turns into more nudging the reps into gamifying their plan. And I think, to me, what you're all constantly striving for when you're designing a new plan is that when gamed, that plan produces what the business wants.
Not the opposite. Like the gaming should be a positive thing, not a negative thing.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It should be a positive thing. And that, in fact, you want your top performers to look at a plan and be like, okay, how do I build my account plan this year?
Working backwards from that. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. And so to do that and not have your reps, which, we see all the time, building their own massive Excel sheets on the side to figure out.
It's exactly what I was doing. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Right. Like you have your account plan, you're going to optimize for your account plan. It actually build, the dashboarding and reporting for the reps on their comp, associated with that. And this is especially true when you have a big comp plan change. So you've probably lived through this. Big change happens to the comp plan. It's a new metric. It's whatever. You're given the new comp plan. Your manager does a presentation kind of explaining it to you.
Yeah.
What's missed is the opportunity is to actually sit down with the reps or give them the tools to help them game the comp plan up front. And I think if you do that right, provide the transparency. On the fairness side, I mean, obviously we touched on quota setting quite a bit. I think that you can't have fairness and equity if the quotas aren't set right because everything in the comp is tied to that.
Yeah.
But I do think there's opportunities where, yeah, we roll like an example. There's like low hanging fruit today. Organizations will, they'll run into a problem. They'll see a metric falling off the grid. They roll out a spiff. Okay, what is that spiff actually consistently fair across the board? Likely not, right? Because maybe I've already sold like in my territory everything that would have got me that spiff in the prior quarter. So I'm not going to get credit for. I'm not going to be able to hit it.
Yeah.
And so this goes back to either improving quota setting for things at like even a spiff at the individual territory level, individual rep level, or thinking about this as to be equitable, we actually need to be individualized. And so when I roll out a spiff, it's not just about rolling a spiff to all 1,000 sellers in the US. It's actually like creating different types of spiffs or different segments where
Relative. Yeah.
I'm giving all the parties that are like all the reps an equal way of earning that extra incremental revenue based off of the uniqueness to their territory. So there's a lot of ways, but I think this is it's a big area an opportunity to fix, because the moment that reps feel inequitable, it's a massive demotivator.
Yeah, it's because I think the best reps in sales love the fact that they have ownership over their, you know, I think every best rep thinks about it as their business. This is my territory, or this is my company and my product to sell, and giving them more ways to drive that ownership can only be better for your top performers. So that's a good point. I just took for granted that like myself and others would just build that. It was like, oh, that's just something you do, versus having that given to you, I think could give a larger percentage of your sellers that ownership and accountability.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And even tying it back to actionable insights. Like, for example, hey, we're rolling out a new multi-year kicker for longer term length.
Yeah.
And as the year progresses, just showing them, hey, your average term length has only gone up by 3 months. Your average peer in your average in your peer group has gone up by 6 months. Had you matched your peer group, you would have made an incremental X dollar amount.
Yes.
Right away, I'm now tying the psychology of like, I relate myself to my peer group. I'm leveraging the competitive nature of it, and I'm tying it back to their dollar amount.
Yeah.
Like, there's so many ways that you can, again, just leverage basic fundamental Psycho 101 principles to truly maximize the ROI of your incentive.
Oh, I love that. And again, didn't even think that was possible before this conversation. So, that's super interesting. Last piece, and we could probably spend the whole next, we could have spent the whole session on this. So maybe just a soundbite, and then people feel free to reach out to Nabeil on this. One of the most common questions I get, because I came from a consumption-based company at Stripe, and now luckily it's very simple with SaaS and annual billing. But how do you think about incentive alignment between go-to-market teams and things like consumption-based pricing, where it's not necessarily clear, does it sit on the product? Is it a success or failure there? Is it the onboarding CS team? Is it the seller? How do you maybe just, again, like a framework to think about this? And then if you want to, we can point someone in the right direction for the details there.
So ultimately, you should optimize incentives for the customer experience. Now, where this is getting more complicated, if you go back 50 years ago, the salesperson, the traveling salesperson, the kind of persona that we imagine, would drive up to the customers with the product in hand. That person was the pre-sales engineer, the sales rep, the BD rep, all the way through to the legal review, signing the contract on the spot.
Yeah.
To now, we're in a world where a single sales process will have 5 to 6, 7 different selling roles, and then the post-sale is just as critical in a consumption world.
Mm-hmm.
And now you have, again, another 4, 5, 6 different roles that contribute to that. And so I think if you step back and define as an organization, what is the ideal customer experience, and then ensure that this is your North Star, that all the other roles in the go-to-market teams, when you're designing their incentives, as long as it aligns to that ideal customer journey and experience, inherently you should kind of have that alignment. Now, you need to do that exercise, and then so this kind of like the bottom up exercise of building toward that customer journey. And then at the very end, you need to do a top down check and make sure, okay, does it actually still produce the ideal outcome? So that's kind of the higher, like the overall aligning go-to-market teams.
Yeah.
The nuance of consumption, again, it makes it even more complex, because now it's not just pre-sale, it's post-sale.
Yeah, that's
And
a long journey, right? You're not just
exactly.
mapping out like a third, a third, a third. It's like, yes, the benefit for the buyer is to get to value and to fully ramp. Well, you need to sign a term sheet. You need to do a technical and business integration. Then you need to ramp that across the business, and then you're there. And that's like a very long period of time with a lot of people internally in the product interfering with what was typically just the seller and maybe an SE and other folks, which
Yeah,
makes it really,
exactly.
really challenging.
And this is where the complexity is like, it's not just the sales ops team in silo coming up with this, or, like the sales comp team. Like, you need input from product, you need ownership
Yeah.
from the engineering teams, you need, the CS and the way that we built the CS function and what purview and what ownership do they have. So in my way, it's so tailored to each business. It does go back to the customer journey.
Yeah.
And, for example, like for some businesses, the consumption that you can, I don't want to say manipulate, it's a bad word, but, manipulate or ultimately for the sense of like getting the customer the most value
Yeah.
might diminish very quickly after the first 6 months. Just the nature of the product, right? If
Yeah.
it's not consumed in a certain way within 6 months, it's just the likelihood of growth. Well, then in that case, you do have to think about incentives being heavily, like, the incentives that we're going to pay on this account are going to heavily be bucketed into this first 6 month journey.
Yeah. And not
Like,
later. Maybe they had a business line that had nothing to do with the behavior and impact on the,
yeah,
on the front end, right?
exactly. Yeah. And I mean, ideally, if that's the business case, then it's like you want to minimize friction of landing that customer early on. And so you can do things with like, simplifying terms, simplifying the pricing so that it's very easy to land. And then like all work goes into this kind of initial onboarding. But that's going to be a very different incentive structure for consumption than if you step back and you think about, the consumption is all about maintaining and growth alignment with the business, and that it's very easy to erode at an ongoing basis. Well, then now I need to have constant account management to make sure that stays top of mind in the business. All that being said is, uh, I don't think this is a different problem that we've solved in sales compensation in the past when it was just
Mm.
pre-sale. It adds additional levels or dimensions to the optimization problem.
Yeah.
And the more variables that you're trying to optimize for at the same time, the more complex.
Yeah.
And the more complex, the more agile you need to be, because you can't like, I can accurately predict if it's one dimension of complexity. If I'm like, okay, well, if I increase my commission rates, I'm going to generate more sales. If I reduce them, and it's one seller back in the 50s, right? Like, if I pay you more, you're probably going to be hungrier and you're going to sell more. But now, yeah, there's way more dimensions at play. So you need to be able to course correct faster, which is where I think if you're in a consumption-based world, having annual comp plans, I don't know. That's, again, depending on the business. Typically, I would say like you're better off actually setting quotas in a shorter sales cycle, quarterly or every 6 months, because the definition of what a good customer journey might actually change far more frequently. So,
Totally. Well, this was super educational, at least for myself. Maybe other folks out there knew all this stuff, but I feel like we could have done a session on each of, setting quotas and just on consumption and just on some of these. So super interesting. Yeah, if you want to chat with Nabeil, what's the best way to get in touch?
reach out on LinkedIn. I'm there to help. Yeah. So,
Amazing.
it's been great. It's a great discussion. And obviously, this is like the world I live and breathe every day. So it's very easy for me to dive right in.
Totally. I think, yeah, before we wrap, my biggest learning is actually, and I love this, I thought it was going to be more spreadsheet based and more tops down. What I actually love about this conversation and kind of think about what we obsess about at Accord and 10 out of 10 GTM and all this stuff is how much it has to do with what you said, the buyer journey and how we're interacting. And it is actually very bottoms up. And that's something that I took for granted. I thought it was more people in a room and just like, what should the math look like from a, board level CFO perspective, that the best teams, it's funny, almost everything in sales, the best things come down to better understanding your customer, the journey, optimizing for that, and everything stemming from there. Obviously, you need the gut check top down to make sure it makes sense with a business that can pay everyone and have continuity. But I think that was something that was really interesting to think about.
Yeah, 100%. It is a math problem, but it's a math problem that's hopefully solving the customer problem, right? The customer
Yes,
journey.
it's rooted. Everything comes from that, which I love your philosophy on that. But yeah, thanks so much for taking the time. I'll let you get back to running your business. But this was a lot of fun.
Yep, absolutely. Thank you for having me on, Russ.